The wind was cruel that morning, howling across the plains like a warning. Dust danced like angry spirits outside the old timber cabin. John Ward was already awake, seated at the edge of his bed, staring at a framed photo of a woman whose eyes had once held his world together. Her name was Ruth, his wife, his compass, and she had been buried on the western hill behind the cabin for almost 2 years now. He hadn't spoken much since then, not to the townsfolk, not even to the Lord. He chopped wood, he grew potatoes, he fed the chickens, and sometimes he just sat there, watching the horizon like it owed him an apology. But that morning, as the sun began to spill orange over the empty, dry land, a shadow moved. Not a coyote, not a wild horse. Something, someone, stumbled from the rocks beyond the riverbed and collapsed. John blinked. For a second, he thought the desert was playing games with him. But then he saw the smear of red trailing behind her. Blood. Real blood. Without thinking, he grabbed his old rifle and stepped out, boots heavy in the dirt. He approached slowly, heart thudding like it hadn't in months. As he got closer, he saw her. Small, young, dark hair matted to her face. Her dress torn and her leg wrapped in something makeshift and soaked through. A necklace made of teeth hung loosely around her neck. Comanche. He paused. They were still feared out here, still remembered by the farmers and ranchers who told stories around fire pits. But this girl, she couldn't have been more than 20. And she was alone, dying. John dropped to his knees. His hands hovered, unsure, then lifted her gently. "Easy now," he whispered, even though she couldn't hear him. She didn't open her eyes, but her fingers gripped his shirt weakly, as if her body knew he was the last chance she had. He brought her into the cabin, laid her on Ruth's old bed. For the first time in 2 years, he lit a fire not to warm himself, but to save another soul. He boiled water, tore up clean cloth. He remembered how Ruth had cared for him when a horse once kicked his ribs, how she'd whispered comfort into wounds. Now he tried to remember those hands. The girl moaned in pain when he touched her leg. The wound was deep. A gash from a blade, maybe. The swelling was bad. She'd need time. Days, maybe weeks. And so he cared for her in silence. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his language. But every time she opened her eyes, there was something fierce in them. Something untamed. She wasn't just a girl. She was someone's daughter, someone important. Still, she didn't fight him. Not yet. 3 days passed. The girl still hadn't spoken. She ate little, slept often, and at night, when John sat outside smoking his pipe, he'd wonder what had brought her here. He hadn't told the sheriff or the town doctor. He didn't want her to be handed over or hanged for something she might not have done. And then came the 4th morning. Theet. Ground trembled before the sound reached his ears. Hooves. So many hooves. When John stepped out, the sun had barely lifted its head, but across the valley, like ghosts rising from the earth, came riders. Dozens of them. 70 by his count. Feathers, spears, guns. And at the front, a man whose presence seemed to bend the very horizon. Tall, stone-faced, war paint across his brow. A chieftain, the girl's father. John's rifle was by the door, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he stood there, alone, unarmed, as the Comanche warriors circled his home. The chief dismounted, walked forward without fear, stopped just 10 feet from John. "You have my daughter," he said in slow, practiced English. John didn't move. "She was dying. You think that gives you rights?" The chief's voice was calm, but it was the calm of a blade before it strikes. "I didn't know who she was," John replied. "I just knew she needed help." The chief looked past him, toward the door of the cabin. "She crossed the border. Without permission," the chief said. She defied my orders. She is to return and face the judgment of her people. John swallowed hard. She's still healing. The chief's eyes darkened. Then you heal her fast. By sunrise tomorrow, she rides with us, or we take her. He turned, gave a signal, and the warriors pulled back, but did not leave. They stayed, encamped, watching. John stood there for a long time after they vanished into the tree line. Then slowly he walked back inside. The girl was awake, sitting up. She'd heard every word, and in her eyes was something new. Fear, but also trust. He sat beside her, not speaking. She reached for his hand. He took it. And in that moment, neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but they knew one thing. They weren't strangers anymore. The night was silent, but not calm. The shadows outside the cabin shifted like whispers waiting to speak. 70 Comanche warriors had surrounded the place, their campfires burning in a ring around John Ward's lonely homestead. They hadn't attacked. Not yet. But every flicker of flame was a warning. You have until sunrise. Inside, the girl was trying to stand. Her leg trembled beneath her, pain etched across her face, but her eyes stayed locked on the door, as if she expected her father to come walking through it any second and drag her away like a misbehaving child. John moved to steady her. You'll tear the wound open. She shoved his hand away. No choice, she muttered, her English broken, but fierce. You think he'll spare you if you return limping? John's voice was low, but the fire in it had returned after years of ashes. You think 70 men will forget why they came just because you can't walk straight? She sat back on the edge of the bed, breathing hard. Sweat dotted her forehead. The silence grew long again between them. Then he asked softly, "Why did you run?" The girl didn't answer for a moment. She stared into the fire. Then she reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled something out. A small carved stone, smooth and shaped like a snake swallowing its own tail. John frowned. What is that? She held it tightly. Symbol of my marriage. You're married? She shook her head sharply. Was. My father forced it. Old man, cruel. He wanted land, an alliance. Her voice cracked with rage. I refused, so they beat me. I ran. John's heart twisted. So this was no simple rescue. This girl, this woman, was not just a chief's daughter. She was a rebel, a shame to her tribe, a runaway from a forced fate. He had seen this story before, only it had been in the eyes of Ruth, his late wife, when she first arrived in his life, fleeing a husband who drank himself into violence. And now here it was again. History, not repeating, but rhyming. You can stay, he said finally. I'll protect you. She looked up at him, surprised. Even if they kill, you? She asked. John nodded. I already died once, when Ruth passed. This, he gestured around the cabin, the land, the fire, is just leftover time. The girl stared at him. Why would you fight for me? He didn't answer, but in his silence was something deeper than words. That night, John took his rifle out back and oiled it. Not because he wanted a fight, but because if it came, he would not stand with empty hands. He didn't sleep. The girl didn't either. At dawn, the horses neighed in the distance. The crunch of boots echoed. Against the still morning air, John stepped out, the rifle in his arms. The chief stood before him again. She does not belong to you, the chief said. I know, John replied, but she doesn't belong to a man who beats her either. You speak as if your law holds here. I speak as a man. The chief raised his hand. Behind him, a warrior stepped forward, carrying a long staff wrapped in red cloth. Under tribal law, the chief announced. When a man challenges the judgment of a father, he may invoke kahatu tai, trial by fire. John narrowed his eyes. And what's that mean? The chief's voice was like a cold wind. You face one of our warriors in a duel. No weapons, no death, only pain. The one who does not yield wins. If you win, she stays. If you lose, she returns, and you never see her again. John looked back at the cabin. He could see her through the window, watching. I accept, he said. The warriors formed, a ring in the dirt. The chosen opponent was a tall, broad man with hands like hammers and a chest carved like rock. He stepped forward, bare-chested, smearing black ash across his face. John dropped his shirt, stepped into the circle. The duel began with no bell, no call, only fists. The first blow sent John to the ground. Blood spurted from his lip. The second cracked against his ribs. The third slammed into his side. But John didn't fall again. He fought, not with speed, not with skill, but with the weight of grief, the fire of justice, and the bones of a man who had lived through too much to fear one more beating. Minutes turned to eternities. The warriors watched in silence. And then, after a final blow, John remained standing while the Comanche fighter dropped to one knee. Yielded. The ring erupted, not with cheers, but solemn nods. Respect. The chief stepped forward. You have won, he said. She stays. But his eyes held something more, something like admiration. He turned and left. One by one, the 70 warriors followed. Inside the cabin, the girl wept when John returned, bruised, broken, bleeding, but smiling. She touched his face. You are not my blood, she whispered, but you fought like a brother. John chuckled softly. I don't want to be your brother. She paused, then smiled back. That night, the wind was kind. For the first time in years, John Ward slept, with peace at his side. The days that followed the duel passed like a new season slowly blooming after a brutal storm. The Comanche warriors were gone. The tension had lifted from the air, but something else had begun to take root inside the cabin. Quiet, unfamiliar, and powerful. She moved slower now, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding that she wasn't running anymore. The girl, who still hadn't told him her name, began to help around the place. She cooked in silence. She swept the wooden floors with focus. She stitched his shirt with her rough hands, though she was better at skinning deer than sewing cloth. John watched her with the cautious eyes of a man who had long since buried his capacity to feel. But he found himself speaking more. Just little things, pointing to tools and saying their names, asking her how to say them in her language. She would nod, sometimes repeat after him, sometimes correct him, sometimes laugh. A rare, short sound, like a crack in a canyon wall. And then, one night, as they sat by the fire, she finally said it. My name is Tala. John looked at her. Means what? She hesitated, then spoke softly. Wolf. He nodded once. Fitting. Tala tilted her head. Why? Because you survived, because you run from no one, and because you were alone, like me. Their eyes met, and the fire between them said the rest. Tala began to ask about Ruth, slowly, carefully. She didn't want to trespass, but she needed to understand the man who had taken a beating to defend her honor. She was soft, John said, his voice low, but strong in a way I never was. She came from a drunkard's house, ran away when she was 19. I found her crying in a church barn. I gave her a room, not a proposal. He smiled faintly. She gave me back my dignity, and then one night, she gave me her hand. He looked out the window. She's buried out there, under the stone I carved with my own hands. Tala nodded solemnly. She would be proud of you. John turned to her. She'd be proud of you. One evening, a stranger knocked at the door. It was the sheriff, Jacob Lorne, a friend from John's old days. He stepped in, looked around, then narrowed his eyes at Tala. "I heard talk of Comanche warriors seen on your land," he said. "Folks are nervous." John stayed calm. "They're gone now." "What about her?" Jacob asked, tilting his head toward Tala. "She's staying here, under my roof." "Your roof's in the county, John. If she's not a citizen, I'll have to report her." "She's not a threat. You know that. I know that. But the council won't care. They'll send men with chains." Tala stood behind John, silent, unreadable. John stepped closer to Jacob. "Then I'll fight those men, like I fought the last one." Jacob studied him, saw the healing bruises, the unspoken resolve. Finally, he nodded. "I was never here." "Die." Left by that night, Tala didn't eat. She sat by the fire with her arms around her knees. "Are you afraid?" John asked. "No," she replied. "Not for me, for you. If they come, you'll lose everything." "I already lost everything," he said. "What I have now is something I chose, and I'm not giving it up." She turned to him. Something in her broke, and for the first time, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't desire. It was something older, sadder, sacred. Weeks passed, and slowly, love returned, not with grand words or passion, but with shared silence, with meals cooked, together, with snow falling as they sat close without needing to speak. Tala began to laugh more. She taught John her language in pieces. He taught her how to plant potatoes. And one spring morning, she placed her hand over his while they sat beneath the oak tree. "There is a tradition in my people," she whispered. "When a woman lays her hand like this, it means she chooses." John looked down, at her hand, at hers and his, then looked at her eyes. "And I accept," he said. That night, beneath the stars, he carved a ring out of bone and slipped it on her finger. And they became husband and wife. Not by law, not by witness, but by the bond of survival, of trust, of sacrifice. But just as peace settled, a sickness came, not to her, to him. It began with fever, shivers, weakness. At first, John laughed it off, just age catching up. But within days he could barely walk. Tala nursed him with every herb she knew, but nothing worked. And then one night he collapsed at the foot of Ruth's grave. Tala screamed. She lifted him, dragged him to bed, held his hand all night. By dawn, his breathing was shallow, his voice faint. He turned to her. "Listen," he whispered. "You have to live, even if I go. You carry what we built. You hear me?" She cried silently. "Tell our child, I fought for her, before she was born." Her eyes widened. She hadn't told him yet. He had known. Her hands pressed to her belly. "I won't let you die," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "You already saved me once. That's enough." And his eyes closed. The cabin had never been so quiet. For 3 days and nights, Tala stayed at his side, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep. Her hands never left his. Her eyes never blinked long enough to dream. The man who had saved her, loved her, fought for her, now hovered between worlds, held only by the thread of her voice. The fever came in waves. His skin burned, then froze. Sometimes he muttered Ruth's name, sometimes hers. Once, in a half-delirious moment, he whispered, "Don't bury me far from her. Let the roots touch." But Tala wasn't ready to speak of graves. Not yet. She wrapped his body in warm pelts, sang old tribal songs she hadn't sung since girlhood. Songs her mother had used to heal the wounded, to calm storms. Words that meant nothing to English ears, but to her were medicine carried on breath. And then one night, the fever broke, just like that. He opened his eyes. "Water," he rasped. She held it to his lips, trembling. "You came back," she whispered, voice cracking. He stared at her. "I never left." John's recovery was slow but steady, and during those quiet spring weeks while he healed, Tala began to build more than a home. She built a future. She planted a new garden. She reinforced the fences. She stitched a small shawl for the baby, woven with deer hair and dyed with river clay. She spoke to her belly every night in Comanche, telling the child stories. Stories of a man who had chosen honor over comfort, silence over cruelty, and her over safety. And one morning, when John stepped out with his cane and saw her standing under the oak, sun on her face, hair blowing wild like prairie fire, he said what he had never said before. "I love you." She turned, smiled, and placed his hand on her stomach. She knows. But peace never lingers long in the wild places. One dusk, hoofbeats thundered on the horizon. John stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, Tala just behind him. It wasn't the Comanche. It was the white men. The sheriff hadn't been able to protect them forever. A government agent in a brown coat dismounted and unrolled a scroll. Under the laws of the Territorial Council, he read aloud, "Unauthorized shelter of a tribal fugitive is a punishable offense. We've orders to remove the woman and assess custody of the child." John stepped forward. "You touch her, you'll have to shoot through me." The wow man didn't flinch. "You'd be dying for a squaw." John leveled the rifle. "I already died the day I let the law take Ruth's rights. It won't happen again." Tala stepped beside him. "I will go, if he lives." John turned to her. No, you won't." But she looked at him, her eyes calm, steady, like the mountain winds. "If I go willingly," she said to the agent, "will you let him be?" The man smirked. "We only came for you." She kissed John's forehead, whispered something in his ear, a single word in Comanche that meant, "Wait." And then she surrendered. They rode away, dust rising behind them like ghosts. John tried to follow, but his strength hadn't returned. Days passed. He went to the sheriff. He went to the preacher. He went to the council. No one would speak for a Comanche girl. No one would defend a marriage not written on paper. And so, John returned to his cabin, waited, watched the moon pass, listened to the wind. Until one morning, 3 months later, a shadow appeared at the edge of the woods. She was barefoot, covered in dust, but unbroken. Tala returned, with a baby in her arms. A girl. "What happened?" he asked, barely believing. She smiled, weak but proud. "They put me in a white tent, asked questions, gave me rules. But one night, an old woman, your preacher's wife, came to me. She gave me a wagon, a loaf of bread, and the name of a road that no one watches." She looked down at the child. She knew what I was running from, because she ran once too. John held them both in his arms, and they wept into each other's silence. Years passed. The child grew wild and free, a daughter of two worlds. She spoke both tongues, shot better than most boys by age 10, and had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet strength. They never registered the marriage, never baptized the child. They lived off the land, between rivers and justice, beneath the same old oak. People called it outlaw love, but to the three who lived it, it was just home. And when the day came that John Ward finally laid down his hammer and his rifle and closed his eyes for the last time, Tala buried him beside Ruth, just like he'd asked, so the roots could touch, and carved his name into the stone with her own hands. He fought not to kill, but to keep.